Dr. Salini, to all of you, is we also reflected about her details in our this email. She completed her MSc from one of the renowned premier institute of India. Even we can say that best institute even in Asian country, Forest Research Institute, FRI Dehradun. And then she has a vast experience in ecosystem service study. Currently, she is a senior scientist at NIRI Nagpur. With this brief introduction, and you will get details about her when you put her name in the Google, you will get easily about her publication, her expertise, and how as a proactive researchers, her role in and developing a research ethics across India. So with this brief introduction, I welcome you all again, and a special welcome to Dr. Salini. And now I hand over to you, Dr. Salini. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharath. I think it's my proud privilege to be part of this IGNOU sustainability course. And I must say, this is all because of the efforts of IGNOU and all these very esteemed faculty and organizers of this course. I have been very interested right from its inception. So that means a lot when I'm invited to share my work and experience to all these participants of this course. I can see some of senior level people are also participating in this course. So that makes it even more interesting and relevant in the present context. I have been given this opportunity to speak more on ecosystem and economic interactions. So I will try to make sure that I do justice with the sections, the units that are allocated to me. And even after my lectures, because I see they are mostly for 1 hour duration. So even if you feel there are certain questions that are in your mind right now when I deliver, or maybe later on, you can pass on these questions to the organizers and they can share with me and I will revert back to all of you. So without much, I think I'll share my presentation, but because I'm going to speak on block 1 of ecology, environment and sustainability, and the very first unit that gives you a basis of the ecology economy interactions. So this is what I will try to cover. And as you know that there are a lot of interactions that happen between ecology and economy. And I will try to introduce you with the evolution of economic thought and what kind of interlinkages are between economy and environment. So this will briefly also give some understanding on modeling of environment economy relationship. So this is briefly that is going to be covered today. And my entire discussion will revolve around different topics, how this historical development has taken place. And in the end, I will try to already also summarize and see what best we can take away, and especially for your exams and what kind of questions are relevant that you should look to. So I will, without much ado, I will share my screen and just confirm if once it is visible on your screen. I'll stop my video for the sake of internet connectivity. I hope it is visible to all of you. And it is moving as well. Just say yes, so that I can.
Yes, it's visible.
Moving. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So as Sharath has already given a very humble introduction, and I am thankful to him for that. So when I talk about ecology, environment, and sustainability, I am sure we all agree that we are living in the era of Anthropocene, where this epoch is highly modified by, highly evolved by the human actions. Now, one thing is very clear, that we have a very significant impact on Earth, and we are trying to have overpower the natural forces, the natural resources, but somehow this is actually damaging our planet. There are still a lot of technological optimists and scientists who see that environmental degradation can actually, the mounting evidence of global environmental degradation can be ignored because it is ensuring human well-being of a larger population. But at the same time, they also argue and give a lot of lame excuses. One of them is they're talking about GDP, the gross domestic product, that this word goes on, and one of the very important and relevant economic terms. They also talk about increasing life expectancies in many nations. I would request the participants, those who are not muted their mics, please mute their mics so that there is no hindrance in between. So they say that life expectancies are increasing because obviously our medical health care has developed a lot. And then of course, many of them also believe that climate change and vulnerability is a very ambiguous term, and we should not very much focus on that. Then there are also claims that we have exaggerated the context of environmental damage. And then there were already predictions like Nostradamus and Lord have already given forecasting about environmental catastrophes that have not happened till now. So that is one of the reasons they say that we should actually ignore many of these, many of these warnings. Now, when I look to this very important figure that many of you might have seen some part of your studies or some part of your career, this is about planetary boundaries. So we have certain planetary boundaries, and it is very clear that many of these planetary boundaries are already crossed. You can see the loss of biodiversity, climate change, nitrogen cycle. So these are some of the boundaries that have already been crossed. And if we cross most of these boundaries, that shows that we are already in a very sensitive and vulnerable condition. And then there is already a growing risk of land degradation, accelerated because of climate change, the mega driver of loss. That is not only affecting biodiversity and ecosystems, it is largely affecting our socioeconomics and politics and how policies are managing these bigger countries. So that means that there is a need, and that's how last year even when Glasgow COP for climate change happened in 2021, it also talked about need of fast transition towards a very low carbon resource resilient economy, and India became one of the very serious thinkers about this, and they have already committed that by 2070 understanding climate justice, we will be going net zero. Now, when I talk about GDP, you will see this slide, and you can understand that even in terms of growing GDP around the world, the bigger players are very few. And these are also the countries that are using and harnessing and exploiting the largest natural resources in the world. And because these natural risks, the economy, the GDP is more because of the natural resources in global south or the third world countries. That shows that economical development is also highly and largely dependent on nature and natural based resources. Now, when talk about GDP, there is a term called GDP per capita. So the growth of any country, the development of any country, the measure, the bar, the scale is basically GDP. GDP is gross domestic product, and it's a monetary measure of the market value of all the final goods and services that a country produces in a very specific time period. So that's like annual growth. So you have a budget year. So every budget year, you know that what your GDP is, how your GDP is increasing or decreasing, what are the reasons behind. And of course, COVID-19 in last 2 years has significantly affected GDP. So many countries are actually struggling for growth, for increasing GDP. Now, this is also a very standard measure of value that creates and adds value for production and goods and services in the country. And it also gives a measure of income earned from that production. So when I say production, it can be personal consumption, expenditure that country makes, then the business investment that country is making, how much government is spending in budget. So that you might see a larger part of budget is allocated in different sections. And this allocation decides what is the commitment, what is the interest of government. And there are certain policies, certain contexts where government want to put more money. There are certain contexts where government doesn't put money despite of a lot of need. For example, if I talk about science and academia, the government spending is still low, whereas a lot of intellect, a lot of technologies, a lot of improvement for technologies that can improve human well-being can come up because of this funding to science and academia. Now, you can also see there is a lot of annual GDP and its contribution that is going and coming from different sectors. So that can be agriculture, construction, mining, transport, and retailing, government services, manufacturing. So there are n number of such services that contribute to GDP, and that is how we make our GDP of the country. Now, there was a second context that we are ignoring is life expectancy. We know that in the very, if you talk about our grandparents, the life expectancy in many of these generations were high, but at the same time, in many generations, it was also very low because of the kind of sanitation, the kind of nutrition they got. So there was a steady decline in the very early midlife of mortality. This is the global data as it is said. But this trend, once there was better sanitation, better housing, education, nutrition, so there was improvement in life expectancy. And later in the half of 20th century, when vaccines came, antibiotics came, when our capability to actually fight these diseases enhanced, that is how our life expectancy also increased. And there is a continued increase in life expectancy because of this new phenomena that is called as the decline in late life mortality. So there are a lot of such arguments and discussions and scientific researches going on that what are the reasons and why we need to actually think about natural resources and not only the very contemporary and very traditional way of thinking about economy. Now, greenhouse gas has its own dimensions. I'll not go into detail, but very briefly, this is about, we are talking about climate finances. So that means these greenhouse gas emissions, their impacts are also being considered. And unless and until there is climate financing, there are chances that many countries are not so much able to go for a better adaptation and mitigation. So now coming to the concept of ecological economics, it's also called as green economics because it deals with ecosystems and ecology. And one of the very primary arguments about ecosystem economics has been that this is actually one of the subfields of ecology that deals with energy, matter transactions. And even in our next lecture, we'll be talking about how energy and matter transactions are related with ecology and environment, and of course, economics. So while GDP has been one of the biggest measures of national income accounting, but at the same time, it has been considered a very vague approach for overweighing market transactions, because this entire economic development is coming on the course on the context of on the stand of natural resources. You talk about mineral resources are coming on the cost of the forest that we are losing. If you talk about energy, the electricity that this country is running on is coming on the cost of coal mines or hydropower projects somewhere in the remote of the Himalayas. So there is an entire cycle of GDP growth on the cost of resource depletion, on the cost of pollution damage, and also failing to measure the real changes in human well-being. So maybe we have got good accessibility and benefits in our lives, but at the same time, this might be not the human well-being. So when I call about human well-being, it's not only materialistic goods and services, it also calls about the psychological goods and services that we are slowly lagging behind. Now, ecological economics is also essentially one of the fundamental relationships out of the implication, and why we need to think about that, how we manage our lives and planet. Because if you talk about ecological economics, and if I share some of my very early experiences, we definitely put a cost on nature. But at the same time, we understand that this nature and natural benefits cannot be measured, cannot be put in a boundary line of a certain value. It's only a relative value that we try to put up. But but largely it's invaluable, because if it gets lost, we cannot pay any value and get it back. So now the ecological economics has itself established it as a pluralistic approach based on seeing that economy is one of the very subsections of this larger biosphere. And we also understand there are a lot of social beings that are agent of changes. And that's why there has been a lot on understanding that more
करता का
work needs to
काय
be done.
जमलं नाही ते व्ह्यू करून सगळं केलं तर
Can you please mute your mic? So that
नाही
means,
आता मी नवीनच करणार होते.
may I request the participants to mute their mics, please? There is somebody having a conversation in between the lecture.
हो पण ते होत नाही ना. मी स्वतः करून पाहिलं 2दा 3दा, मग तुम्ही त्या दिवशी
Ashwini Pandas,
बोलवलं
can you please switch off your? Ashwini ji, can you please mute yourself? I request you to please keep your mic on mute unless and until you have anything to ask. So now more work is actually tried that we look beyond this other ways of doing economics, where we actually try to bring prospects of nature conservation by doing ecological economics, and someday our planet and resources are conserved. So that means that there is a new economic paradigm, and this paradigm shift has to be well understood. And this is very important in the context of sustainability that we are talking about, and that can help us to develop a complex and adaptive system, be it adaptive agriculture or adaptive ways of living our lives in cities. So this neoclassical, so in this particular context, there comes new neoclassical economic approach that are linked with modeling and tools, where we actually use the basic stakeholder responses or the scenarios, and we develop the future scenarios with reference to the drivers that are affecting these resources. And based on these scenarios, the business as usual scenarios or more conservationist scenarios, we try to understand that what kind of policy should be framed, what kind of policy should be made, so that we can reduce this kind of uncertainty, we can reduce the negative impacts of nature, at the same time enhance positive values. So there are a lot of such lot of agent-based modeling that needs to be in place to actually come up with better policy decisions. Now, one of such example is this recent report that came in 2015, where Dr. Madhu Verma from IIFM Bhopal actually went ahead and did this economic valuation of tiger reserves across India. So now it was a more of value creation approach, where we know that government of India is putting a lot of money in developing tiger reserves across the country. And because tiger is a top predator, she tried to relate that actually the value of this is a very large value. So this value can actually is not only help to conserve these tigers, but also helping to retain and reinstate a lot of ecosystem services. So these are worth of about 2,567 to 8,260 crore Indian rupees per year. So this is the amount of value that came with a very neoclassical approach of doing economics for ecological benefits. Now, when I talk about evolutionary economics, over the historical development that took place in economics, it is linked to the complexity of science and system-based understanding, system-based dynamics. I talked about agent-based models, where you have these different agents, where ecosystems and different biotic and abiotic components that interact with each other, and that is how we got understand that what can be the drivers of this change, how these are drivers going to affect, what can be the scenarios, what will be the trends, and that is how we do the entire network analysis. And this is something where this ecosystem-based modeling, this economic modeling can fill this gap for better understanding and action of policymakers. And this can be a very good tool. Now, giving this one of the examples from IPBES, if you have heard about Intergovernmental Panel, may I ask Dr. Ritu Rastogi to please mute her mic? So when I talk about these, one of the examples of these agent-based model, if you have heard about Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, that started in 2012 and has given some of the very relevant regional and global assessment report. So this very much uses modeling approaches, and then IPCC reports also use modeling approaches to show you different scenarios. What are the conservative scenarios? What are the business as usual scenarios? What are the scenarios, and how this country, how this world will be if these scenarios are there? So the idea is to make you understand what will happen in different scenarios and where actually country and government should move so that we can reduce these kind of negative impacts. So the broader goal of this is to provide a platform for evolutionary and institutional economic thinking among all, and to contribute for the development of this new economic paradigm that talks about sustainability, that talks about inclusiveness of everyone around. And this is one of the examples. If you see this circular economy approach, it also talks about nature conservation, and that's why it talks about reusing, reducing, and ensuring that we minimize our impact, we minimize our requirement from the nature by using the circular economy approach, where everything is utilized and this utilization is maximized by improving the technologies, better designs, better products, and reducing the waste as well. Now, this is how it will look like if we start thinking in this new economic paradigm where inclusiveness and sustainability is in the very core of this entire discussion. So your planetary boundaries, the change to planetary boundaries can be addressed. And at the same time, it will also consider that social well-being, human well-being at address. So when I talk about social foundation, it is about nutrition, it is about access to potable water, access to good health services, gender equality, whatever sustainable development goals 2015 are talking about. And fortunately, today is the day when sustainable development goals are celebrated, like every year affair, when we need to recognize and acknowledge that very important initiative and endeavor of United Nations. Now, coming back to the GDP discussion again, so that means that your real GDP, gross domestic product, and at the same time, now in the country, there are slowly having discussions on moving from GDP to GNP, from gross domestic product to gross natural product, how much of natural products we are conserving. So this discussion is, while again coming into our discussion, I would like to also mention it was Dr. Anil Agrawal long back in early 80s, who was the founder of Center for Science and Environment in New Delhi, who actually started talking about gross natural product when he saw that how women in a rainy village of Uttarakhand went ahead and started this Chipko movement to save their forest. So that was the value of natural products for them. And this is still the value that is very much relevant, that needs to be recognized by the country, by the policymakers, and all stakeholders. Now, when I talk about the real GDP, that means we have to consider physical capital. We have to consider how much hours of labor is included, because the energy dynamics also comes from the man days of and man hours of labor given to do that activity. Then, of course, the human capital, the knowledge, the natural resources, and social infrastructure. So these are some of the components of having the real GDP concerns. Now, giving you a brief about what human capital looks like. So human capital is more about bringing that knowledge, bringing that intelligence to this entire functioning and processing, because your GDP is also run by the human capital. So it's the knowledge, it's the creativity, it's the training, the abilities, good health, judgment, because if you have good health, if you are able to do rational thinking, if you have the wisdom to understand what's right and wrong, so that kind of systems and that kind of human approach is what human capital brings in this entire development. Now, there are man-made, tangible, physical, non-financial assets, but to get production of goods and services from these raw materials, these are what physical capitals are. So these are again a very important part of GDP. And then these physical capital are also like the working capital and fixed capital, something that is an asset and something that is a liquid asset, such as cash, your dollars. So your world runs on dollars and such liquid assets. So these are the two important physical capitals that are also part of this GDP and very important ones. So these are some of the segregation that I've tried to explore. Your physical capital is more about the asset that is tangible, whereas your human capital is very intangible. It's more of human intelligence, human understanding, the wisdom of doing things. Whereas physical capital can be sold. There is no market. I mean, we can say that we can have jobs based on intelligence, but at the same time, that human capital is not sold in the market. It's like nature where you can not put an actual and appropriate value to human capital. Then they are completely mobile, or physical capital and human capital are not completely mobile. Restriction or movement of people, restrictions also makes these differences. And then physical capital are more about private benefit. It only benefits people who are owning this machine or owning that kind of asset, whereas human capital can do both private personal good, and at the same time, if it is rationally used, it can bring the societal benefit for the larger country, larger society as well. Now the another asset is intellectual capital. Now this is very important, and that's where countries should expend a lot of their budget in actually harnessing these benefits. If you see these developed countries like in the global north, like US, or in the European countries like Germany or Australia, they put a lot of their efforts on intellectual capital, because intellectual capital is something that can uh, bridge the boundaries, and that can bring up better changes and better improvement in terms of the kind of education they are imparted, the kind of R&D facilities they are given, and the new business ideas or startups or whatever better financial support they're given. So intellectual capital should be considered as one of the important ways where from a very small number of population you can bring better changes. Now coming to the most important one, the natural capital, on which your capital assets are built, on which your human capital depends. And of course, your intelligence, your intellectual capital is also largely linked with kind of natural capital. So these are the biotic and abiotic factors, and at the same time, non-renewable and as well as renewable sources. And they largely regulate the biogeochemical cycles. And now biogeochemical cycles are again something that are linked to the planetary boundaries, your carbon cycle, your nitrogen cycle, your phosphorus, your climate change. Everything gets disturbed if your natural capital gets disturbed. And then of course the ecosystem, goods and services, the nature's contribution for human well-being. So while Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report 2005, that was the first one to coin the term of ecosystem, there came the second report, and the shift that happened was because of Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And from 2012 onwards, the new terminology was given name, and this was nature's contribution for human well-being. So now nature's contribution are again ecosystem, but in this part, the social component is also very much integrated. The psychological benefits, the nature connectedness, and under the cultural benefits, and so on and so forth. So this is all the ecosystem capital and the important component of nature capital. Now, this can be anything. This can be the provisioning services, the resources that we get directly from the forest areas or natural resources, the fishes. This can also be the regulating services, the flood regulation or clean water that we get, the carbon storage, climate regulation, the supporting services like biogeochemical cycles, good habitat, and of course, last but not the least, the cultural services, the psychological benefits, the natural connectedness. So this seems to be one of the important aspects of this entire GDP discussion, and also ecological economic discussion, where your natural capital, natural resources, biodiversity actually leads to local, regional, as well as global well-being. Now, why it is so important? I mean, we have always have this discussion, and we very much acknowledge and recognize that any country, their economic activity is run by the natural capital. If I talk about the Middle East countries that are producing some of the best fossil fuels for the world, while they don't have enough of good terrestrial resources, but they have this natural capital that's their fossil fuel. So this gives them a good edge and privilege of economic activity because they have more of this capital goods and services. So that also means that if we extract beyond carrying capacity of nature and lead to environmental damage, we are actually going to degrade our natural capital. So it is not only going to put our present economy at risk, it will compromise the sustainability quotient. It will also compromise the goods and services and benefits that our coming generations are entitled and have all rights, all human rights to get for. So that's why natural capital becomes very important. If you don't have natural capital, I'm sure we all understand that our economic activity will also go on toss. We also know that a lot of Middle East countries are having war because their natural capital, especially water and all these resources, are fast depleting. So that's also said a lot of these tensions and wars are also because of natural resources. So to prove supremacy to prove our supremacy on the resources of others. Now, so there are natural capital assets that gives us ecosystem services, and I talked about these ecosystem services, and then include a lot of benefits, and these benefits can also be called as nature-based solutions for human well-being, and all these well-being have a big dollar value. And now this dollar value has to be assessed using ecosystem-based, ecological economic-based tools. Now, this is one of the primary talks where I'm giving you a brief of the overview. In the forthcoming lectures, I'll be talking about how these approaches are, what kind of tools we use. There are different kind of tools, and what are the basic concepts of the ecological economics. So there is also a discussion of bioeconomy and natural capital in the context. For example, certain states of India, for example, if you talk about Uttarakhand and Northeast, or some parts of Western Ghat, a lot of these communities have good understanding of plant-based products. And there is also talk about getting benefit from these and develop bioeconomy. So is it possible to develop bioeconomy? Do we have that amount of resources? And if resources are there, the intellectual capital that is involved, the intelligence of people, the traditional and indigenous knowledge system, they get intellectual property rights? And that's where access and benefit sharing context comes in. And that's where the post 2020 biodiversity target is now talking more about access and benefit sharing to people who are the right owners of this knowledge to use their knowledge to develop products and develop bioeconomy from nature-based or natural capital. So when I talk about bioeconomy, we recently did a publication for Kashmir because still it is one of the areas and one of the states that haven't seen a lot of development because of a diverse reason. But at the same time, it has all opportunities with having good forest areas, having good amount of biodiversity, that it can actually take a leap and develop a sustainable economy if we use a natural capital approach, where we have all-inclusive interactive governance system, where right-based approaches, indigenous knowledge systems are respected and integrated, shared language, where policymakers and local people talk about the same concepts, have a consensus about same type of concerns, so that we can develop a more harmonized vision that also talks about interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and multidisciplinary collaboration to ensure, because biodiversity is not only the subject of a botanist or zoologist or a biotechnologist or molecular biologist, it goes beyond that. You also need a social scientist, you also need an economist. So with that kind of interdisciplinary collaboration, then only we can talk about sustainable bioeconomy that can be more adaptive by the changing values and terms. Now, for this entire process, it's important that there is a proper decision making for nature. Decision making that they ensure that harvesting of resources is very sustainable in nature and respects the laws of sustainable conservation. Now it's important, and it is now very well proven also with my discussion in the previous slide, that economic activity can bring both positive and negative impact. So this is on the stakeholders, how they take this human well-being opportunity, the production and consumption of goods and services opportunity to ensure, because their constant growth, their constant sustainable growth needs significant support from natural capital. So what can be positive impacts there if we harness more than what we are entitled to? What will be the negative impact if we do that? So that kind of a cost benefit analysis needs to be taken care of. A proper protocol should be there so that sustainable harnessing our approaches are there. World is right now going to see one of the largest reports by Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services in July, where there will be a release on sustainable use of wild species, be it gathering from the forest, be it hunting inside the forest, be it timber felling inside the forest, or any wild resources, or be it the kind of non-extractive activities. For example, we're going inside a tiger sanctuary or a forest area, and we have these number of jeeps and safari vehicles that go in hundreds of numbers. So what should be the carrying capacity? How much should go in one point of time, so that we have a harmonized balance between economic activity and natural capital. So these kind of activities are already happening, and some interesting reports are going to come. Now, what have been the critics of current normative economics that we're talking about? So the current normative economics approach has been criticized a lot. And one of the major reasons have been whatever I talked about natural capital and economic development. It's only the kind of discussion we always have. But in real terms, the approach towards natural resources and capital is very different. We give more value to capital and less value to the natural resources. And many a times it has always been, many times it has also been observed that the conventional, the traditional environment economic approaches have undervalued the natural capital. As I mentioned, we can never truly value a natural resource. So there has been undervaluation because your economics runs on market cost, the market value of a certain commodity. So this has resulted in undervaluation. The second thing is it is treated as a factor of production that is interchangeable with labor and technology, the human capital. Well, that's not the case in reality. It has been claimed in the normative economic theories and studies that human capital is complementary to natural capital rather than it is interchangeable, as human capital inevitably derived from natural capital in one form or another. But that's not the case. Your human capital is not directly proportional to natural capital. So that kind of thinking has not gone, and that's why the new economical approaches and studies are considering all these gaps and drawbacks as well. Now, the other important critics of normative economic theories are that it also rejects the theory of energy in economics. I will be discussing about this in my next lecture. We'll be talking about the laws of thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created and destroyed. But in this case, they have also rejected the theory of energy economics and the growth in energy supply that is related to directly for well-being. So instead focus on biodiversity and creativity that needs to be sometimes adopted to describe them economically. That has been lagging. And the ecological economic has focused mostly on key issues related to uneconomic growth and measured well-being, measurable well-being. So these are some of the context. And what is the importance of human well-being has not been analyzed. Mostly we analyze human well-being from the materialistic point of view. We get the provisioning services, we are getting benefit, we are getting economic value, but we never talk about the psychological values, the social values, the cultural values. So these are also some of the hindrances that have been observed in current approaches to economics. Now, taking you a little bit to the historical development of this economic ecological thought process and what has been the evolution, how this has been part of this relationship that has evolved over the time period. So when we go little back around 1800 and late 1700, we found that there were some very important classical theories of economics, and there were this Adam Smith, then you have David Ricardo, then you have John Stuart Mill and Thomas Malthus, who have actually shaped up this classical economist theory. While many of these classical economics theory have been heavily criticized over the time period, but still sitting after almost 300 to 350 years ahead of this time, we find that many of these theories given by these classical economists are still relevant. They find their place. For example, Adam Smith has given laissez-faire theory. I'll be talking about this in the forthcoming slide. Then came laissez-faire capitalism theory by Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo. Then utilitarian theories by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Utopian socialism theory by Robert Owen. And of course, one of the biggest philosophers and economists, Karl Marx, who have given the theory of communism, and then Friedrich Engels, who have again supported and given the next level of Marxism and communism. So if you talk about laissez-faire, it talks about basically the policy of leaving things to take their own course. So David Smith believed that we should keep people free, and there should be a free market that can help everyone to produce more goods at lower prices and make them affordable to everyone. While this is a very goodwill theory, a very theory that keeps everyone happy, I'll be talking in detail about Adam Smith. Then you have Thomas Malthus, who believed that poor would always suffer, and stated that population has to grow faster, and this growth will be exponential growth, where the way we supply food supplies and how they are grown will not be as exponential as population growth, and that is one of the reasons people have to suffer. Then David Ricardo talked about iron law of wages. He talked about wage increases that only encourage larger families. So, and then Thomas Malthus, who talked about supported the basic ideas by Adam Smith of free market, but at the same time, he also criticized a few of his ideas. So laissez-faire was one of the important theories that was the very starting of this classical theories. So Adam Smith, who was the very first founder of this classical theory group, he talked about wealth of nation in his classical book on economics, and one of the very center of this idea was division of labor. So that means labor is divided across the society, and when the labor is divided, the workers perform same task over. So for example, if you see the current society, even though your labor is divided, your certain section of people are doing certain kind of thing, the people who are going to office have a certain task to go, and that means, so if and for example, we as scientists or somebody like academic or somebody as a bureaucrat has to do similar kind of task over the time period again and again. If we give them a different kind of responsibility, even if you know that in offices, whenever shuffle happens, whenever shuffling of tasks happens, it takes a lot of time for the new recruitment or a new person who is transferred to a new position to understand the task and the expectation. Whereas if the same person is doing the same kind of job over the time period, what happens? The productivity improves. Their productivity increases because they are very much capable to understand and do that task in a much efficient manner. And he also believed, Adam Smith also believed, as he is called as the founder of modern economics as well, he believed that self-interest was the factor that fueled the economy, while competition was a regulator. He said that it's not the interest of the butcher or the somebody who is selling vegetable in the market or somebody who is selling something else in the market. that you should get food or you should get the things that are required for society. It's basically for his own interest. It is for his own livelihood interest. So he also viewed the competitive market scenario. He says that if everybody sells in the same price, even if you go in the market, you ask about the potatoes or tomatoes, you will find that everybody is selling them on more or less on the same price. Because if somebody increases the price and somebody decreases the price, that becomes the reason of purchase getting more from that shop or getting reduced from that particular shop. The competitive market was the assumption. Adam Smith assumed that the consumer is well informed, whereas in the real world conditions, many times the consumers are not that informed. Many of us don't do market survey when we go to the market. We go and buy the things and come back. So these were some of the things that were criticized also. But this is what Adam Smith, theories were laissez-faire policies and competitive market. So these are some of the things that you can keep in your mind, as he was the first modern founder of modern economics. And then we come to this laissez-faire that he talks about. He talked about free market. He said that the government should not be very much restricting interventions, and the market should be free. Everybody is able to do free market economy, and there is freedom for followers to make decisions. Kevin ji, may I request you to mute your mic, please? Kevin Kesh, please mute your mic. Kevin ji, please mute yourself. Please mute your mics, those who are entering this room. Kevin, it's really disappointing when you enter the class and you keep talking. So this policy talked about leaving things to take their own course without any interference from the government. While the benefits are that it removes ineffective bureaucracy at many times, it stimulates innovation and creativity. It also encourages a lot of autonomy in business, and it also reduces and makes your business free from regulation, trade restrictions. But at the same time, it also leads to economic and wealth inequality. So somebody who is selling more may will get more income and wealth inequality. It also creates monopoly because there are no government rules imposed, and there are no regulations also. And then it also prevents new players from entering market, because you have established market. You don't have government to regulate this market. You don't have restrictions, taxes, subsidies, and tariffs. So that also means that there will be lower wages for people who are working in this market. There might be high product prices and limited supply also. So these are some of the benefits and criticism of laissez-faire theory that was given by Adam Smith. Now coming to another theory that Adam Smith gave was the theory of value. So the theory of value was value in use and value in exchange. So while value in use is referred to how useful an item is, the value of exchange meant the good relative to every other good. So he basically talked about total utility rather than marginal utility. And he also stressed that that labor is the source of this value. So most of his ideas were basically based on division of labor and the way it can increase production. So that is how he talked about this market and the entire economic theory. But he encountered a biggest problem with circular reasoning when he tried to formulate a labor cost theory of value. And that is one of the major fallouts, major failures of Adam Smith. And Karl Marx also rejected his labor theory of value because this is not the way market runs.
अच्छा too slow थी क्या? Back रख दो अपना.
Manisha ji, please mute your mic. So now, from macroeconomic level, according to Smith, it was all dependent on distribution of economic capital or economic distribution of income. He segregated the entire society into three classes. The entire market was divided into capitalists, the laborers, and the landlords. So the more money the capitalist had for profit, according to him, the economy would grow more. But at the same time, this capitalist theory was highly criticized later on. He believed that economic circle of life started with division of labor. Even if in society you see that there is division of labor at from the very lower level. So that leads to how productivity will be. And increase in productivity, he related that increase in productivity will lead to increase in wages, and this increase in wages will result to higher average income well as higher consumption level. So for Smith, the wealth of the nation was increase in per capita income. So that was a very realistic theory that he gave, that for any wealth of the nation, for any nation to grow, it is important that their per capita income is considered, and if it grows, that means that country is developing. And still, this is the very much basis of how developed and developing countries are segregated. So the final step was to increase the capital accumulation, which should be the result of increase of national income or national wealth. But in this entire scenario, the concern and context was that capitalist had his profit. If capitalist doesn't have their profit, there are chances that per capita income will also now not increase. And the only way, according to him, to save and reinvest the surplus was to keep it in the hands of the capitalists. So while the communists are somebody who are against many times these capitalist theories, so this was one of the narrow-minded views that stayed constant through much of the classical period of economics, where the power was given to the capitalist, and that is how there was a lot of criticism also about this entire theory. Now there was this second person, also David Ricardo, the economist, who talked about income distribution. He talked about theory of value, law of comparative advantage, Ricardian equivalence, and deductive analysis. So there are a lot of these theories that they gave. But for your subject, it is just an understanding that you should know actually who Adam Smith was, what kind of theories he gave, and what was so good about it, what are still followed. That's sufficient for this particular chapter and this particular course that you're doing. Because these are hardcore economic theories also, and I'll not go into all these details of these theories. So for Ricardo, there were three classes: the good, the performing capitalists who were actually earning the whole profit from the market, the invisible labor. If you see this scenario even right now, is invisible labor who earned the wage, and the evil landlords who did nothing and collected the rent. So this is still the situation in the market, and you will find these scenarios where your capitalists are replaced by the millionaires and billionaires, and then you have these invisible laborers who actually are the people who make the GDP of the country. And then there is the rise of this theory of rent by Ricardo, and his most famous theory was comparative advantage, that said that international economic theory in two countries, in which two countries can trade with each other and benefit each other, is what makes comparative advantageous position. So for example, he gave example of two countries where one country was very good in making these rugs of jute, and other was very good in making beer. So the burlap or the jute rugs that one country was making, so one country is more efficient in making the best of the beers in the world, while other is, because they are traditionally doing it for generations, and the other is very good in making the burlaps. So one good nation would try, the one who is making beer would like to specialize in making beer, while a nation who is want to make burlap. So there is a competitive advantage. So the nation that has more specializes in the certain kind of task has more opportunity to increase this opportunity cost. So eventually both of these countries will equalize their respective opportunity cost, allowing them to trade outside their production and possibilities even into other frontiers and other countries. So this was the comparative advantage theory that was given by Ricardo. And this talked about very practical applications. While Adam Smith was talking about absolute advantage, Ricardo was talking about comparative advantage. So, for example, in the very late 1700, what happened that England imposed a corn law. So that meant that the price of food was artificially high because of certain and severe restrictions that were imposed on imported grain. So when there were a lot of restrictions, and that is also the scenario in right now, if you can try to correlate with the increasing petrol price and fuel price in the country, as the price started increasing, as the imports were reduced there because of the restriction, the prices started increasing and the subsistence level followed. So capitalists were forced to pay the subsistence level to the workers because for one to survive and one to live, it is important to have food and important to have that at least basic parameters of health to survive. So it was certainly not the fault of the laborers that they wanted food to live. So Ricardo blamed the landlords of increasing this price that reduced the supply to the market. And at the same time, also England, the government of England, to support landowners by placing these kind of restrictions that affected the wagers. So Ricardo believed that a theory of value was important in explaining economic forces that can cause changes in relative prices over the time period. So he also believed that there needs to be at least some demand for product before it enters the market. For example, if somebody wants to make a product and want to have a startup and he does not do a market survey, that means he doesn't understand what will be the fate of the product in the market. So that means that if you have that kind of understanding and there is a demand of that product in the market, there is definitely that market will fetch good price to that kind of product. And this kind of thinking and this kind of belief has only led to a lot of market strategizing market under the understanding the market surveys, and then only placing the product in the market. So that means this theory is still in the relevance. Then there was William Stanley. So we talked about Adam Smith. We also talked about Ricardo, and both of them were having different kinds of thoughts and theories. And then Stanley Jevons was more of a philosopher of the early 20th century. He revolutionized the economic theory and shifted from classical to neoclassical theory. So he is known for his work on marginal theory of value, and he recognized the critical importance of energy for the economic growth, something that was not very much considered by Adam Smith and Ricardo, was very much considered by William Stanley. And he said that energy is important for the development. And in present time, it's so much of a reality. If you don't have coal, if you don't have fossil fuels, your countries, your development will all go on toss. So in that times, energy primarily meant coal. And so it also meant that if coal resources are going to dwindle, it will affect the development of the country. He highlighted the critical role that coal played in British economy and their expansion. And he held the theory that the utility, the value of each additional unit of a commodity is less and less to the consumer. While you are thirsty, for example, if you're very thirsty, you are in the market, you get a glass of water. So that probably means that by this one glass of water, your thirst is quenched. So the second and third glasses of water might not have that value that first glass of water will have. So this was the utility value of each additional unit of commodity. The marginal value gets reducing and it keeps reducing to the customer. So this was the theory and how it framed. He also feared that supply coal is going to be exhausted, and he was very right about this. And he also considered that this will lead to increase in prices of coal and so many other things associated. But conclusion was wrong, because at that point of time in early 20s, coal was mined most from surface areas. The open cast mining was done. While as technology progressed, we now know that coal is extracted from even deeper depths. So that means the improvement in technology kept the price stagnant for a certain period of time. However, he was right that resources are going to be exhausted, and resources are when going to be exhausted, well, they will enhance the price of this energy and resources. Now, the last one is Karl Marx. Sorry, so it's already 12, but I think I can take next 15 minutes. If this is fine with everybody else as well. So Karl Marx stands, he's one of the very outstanding philosophers and economists. And his work was mostly on the book he published was the Communist Manifesto. He believed in the labor theory of value, and he presented a great challenge to laissez-faire economics in Das Kapital, one of the very famous books that he wrote. And he was the best known critic, the biggest critic of capitalism, and with a very poor sense of finance because he was more of a philosopher and social theorist. And he was also a left-wing radical personality, and he was very different than David Ricardo. He believed that capitalism can create a kind of alienation and exploitation of labor force, and he was very right in doing and saying so. And he said that profits can only be had through exploiting workers. You give less wage to people, and you keep building the benefits, the interest. So for him, it was the big bad capitalist versus the meek and poor laborer, because he always thought about the theory of equality, the theory of well-being for everyone. And he also believed that there are three ways to increase the surplus value or profit. The first way how capitalists do is increasing the the length of the workday. You know, whenever certain companies, certain industries, they run 5 days or 6 days a week. So by increasing the length of the workday, instead of 7 days or 8 days, 8 hours per day, it might be 12 hours per day. That is how this industry runs, to make the benefits and profit, increase the intensity of the work output, and reduce the wage bill. So while they pay less, they make big profit. And this is how most of the private companies they run. They pay less, they have the longer working hours, and at the same time they have increased intensity of the work output. So that very much follows the Karl Marx theory. And then all three of them, according to him, was detrimental to the wager, and it was only helpful for the capitalist who was doing this for the growth of his profit. So just as stock prices seem to go up at the news of the day, so did the company's value back then. So this was the entire approach of seeing the capitalist theory from the lens of Karl Marx, who was against this entire theory. Then Malthus was there, and Malthus talked about the population growth theory. He said that human population increases geometrically while food production increases arithmetically. So according to this entire theory, humans should eventually be unable to produce food to sustain themselves. However, according to Malthus, there are three factors that he mentioned that can control human population. One is the carrying capacity. I will be talking about this in my next lecture. Carrying capacity is a very important topic, and at the same time, it also relates with the recent the new approaches to environmental impact assessments. So understanding the carrying capacity of a certain landscape, a certain area, we do this as scientists. And then how many people can live in a certain area considering the amount of available. So there is a certain carrying capacity of that landscape. So once it surpasses, that means human well-being cannot be ensured. And Malthus defined these factors as war, famine, and disease. But there are many more in the current context. If the industrialization is beyond carrying capacity, or urbanization, mining, or anything beyond carrying capacity, it will compromise the benefits for the community. However, these theories were also criticized by forthcoming economists, and ultimately, especially his human population growth theory was disapproved. Now, the classical period of economics brought some very good ideas, and I'm sure you will agree what Adam Smith brought, what Ricardo brought, what Karl Marx brought. They were having a lot of sense. While Ricardo was talking about comparative advantage, Karl Marx talks about abstract labor. Smith talked about advantages of division of labor, how it can benefit the market. And the classical period also have some of the very strange ways of thinking about demo economy. But still, after so many years, we see that these terms are still lingering around. And there are like market failure. This was an important concept. And when in my next lectures, we will be talking about when we discussed hardcore economical approaches for ecology, we'll be talking about market failure. Then temporal aspect of resource use efficiency of Harold Hoodling also contributed to this evolution of discourses. Now, similarly, there were other scientists and philosophers who were talking about. I'm sure you are knowing about Darwin's theory of evolution. So, so it was a very notable advances in scientific field. Then the conceptual issues of ecology by Ernest Haeckel, who was also a very good artist. And then the theory of thermodynamics, the predator-prey relationship that was given by Lotka in the Lotka-Volterra model by Alfred J. Lotka is another important. I'm sure those who are doing ecology, if they want to understand more about prey-predator relationship, the food chain dynamics, they need to understand this Lotka-Volterra model as well. Now, this is one of the very important books after this entire, we are now standing in early 1981, and we are seeing this very important book by Julian Simon that was on the ultimate resource. So there was this book that came in 81 and challenges the notion of humanity that was running out of natural resources. So the revised version came in 96, and these are some of the very important books. And he said that there is no resource crisis as a particular why there is no resource crisis is that as a particular resource become more scarce, its prices increase. So when coal becomes less or when fossil fuel is depleting, the prices are also increasing. And this price rise creates an incentive for people to discover more of this resource, ration and recycle it, and eventually develop substitute. So that is also working in the present context. While there are incentives for people to discover more resource, more technology, advancements are taking place, how best we can recycle the resource, how best we can reuse the overburdened dumps, or how best we can use the benefits of circular economy for the larger well-being of the world. And then the ultimate resource is not any particular physical object, but the capacity of humans to invent and adapt. So nothing is like physical resource. You know, when fossil fuels are going to be depleted, world and scientists and countries are already thinking about solar. They are already moving a lot. If you see in India itself, our renewable source of energy supports almost 40% of energy demand of the country. So while there is still almost 60% coming from coal and other resources, our country is developing to get, so there is nothing called ultimate resource. Then you also know that country is also talking about green hydrogen and all these resources that can be really beneficial. So there is nothing called ultimate resource. There is always in the capacity of humans to keep thinking, keep inventing and doing something new. For example, even when the COVID came, nobody thought about the vaccine coming in such a small span of time. So human capital, the intellectual capital is something that can breach this barrier. And this was also one of the controversial claims in the book was about natural resources are infinite. So that's not the case. And he says that infinite physical amount of, for example, copper, but might be this is for copper, but for human purpose, that resource should be treated as infinite because it is not binded or limited to any economic sense. So these are some of the controversial statements also that were in the book. But at the same time, he very much appreciated uh, uh, that the population is declining and then world food supply is improving and then there is nothing called ultimate resource. So these were important theories, and there was this important theory by Hardin, the tragedy of commons. I'm sure those who have known little bit about even some of the other economists uh, who have worked on tragedy of commons. So this is one important theory that whenever, and this is based on carrying capacity, there is a certain carrying capacity of even commons because they are not very much regulated. But at the same time, it talks about environmental degradation, population growth, limited natural resources, and privatization of land that can lead to the tragedy of these commons. We'll be talking about, there is a specific section of on tragedy of commons. So I'll be covering this in entire detail. Now, a very important, some of the last slides as I'm towards conclusion now, is the cost and benefit by a producer that leads to externalities. Now, externalities are that can be positive, that can be negative. So, externality is the basic cost or benefit created or caused by a producer that is not financially incurred or received by that producer. For example, you are going, if somebody is smoking sitting next to you, so it's a negative externality to you because you are passively smoking while you are not making payment for that. The next person sitting next to you is actually leading to kind of diseases that you might catch because of this passive smoking. Similarly, industries are having emissions, vehicular emissions. So this will lead to, that is improving their lives, but at the same time, it is a negative externality to people living in that surrounding. It's also a negative externality for a person who is walking on the road and is not actually interested to actually inhale all that smoke. Whereas the positive externality can be, for example, you take a bicycle to ride down to your working place or to your school or to your college. So while you cycle down, you are not paying for it, but it reduces your amount. It reduces your money to go and reach to a place. At the same time, it can also help improve your health because you are cycling. It's kind of a physical exercise. So these are some of the examples of externalities, and these are something that also lead to market failure. So these are some of the terms that again I will be dealing, but in detail. But here is one kind of inference to these topics. So these are negative production externalities and positive consumption externalities. Something that you don't pay for, but that improves your well-being or improves the condition. And negative is something that you don't pay for, but knowingly or unknowingly. For example, there is a temple or there is a marriage in certain area, and there is this huge loudspeaker, and on a very high pitch, it is playing songs. Well, it can be very good for somebody who is attending the marriage, but somebody in the neighborhood might not be very comfortable, might be sick, might be old, some student might be having their exam. So this is the kind of negative externality to them. So now market economists tend to advocate that use of incentives to basically reduce environmental externalities rather than command and control approaches. So the incentive should be paid for reducing the environmental externalities. So whatever you do, it should not affect the environment. And and this approach of incentives actually allows flexibility to respond to these problems. So while if you enforce a certain kind of policy or law, it might be not very successful. But if you put a flexibility of incentives, like if you do that, we'll give you some kind of subsidy. For example, when groundwater depletion started, and recently government has placed, like if you are building a house and constructing a house and you put a solar on your house, it is subsidized. You put a rainwater harvesting tank, it is subsidized. So it's like a doing positive externality and reducing negative externality by some kind of incentive. Then free market economists also focus on eliminating obstacles that prevent the market from functionally freely. So this is very much at the uh, level of government also to remove these so that environmental protection and resource use takes place. And then of course key objective for environmental economics is to identify particular tools and alternatives. What will be the impact of certain kind of tools and approaches to ensure conservation of resources? So these all needs to be very much considered, and this is how free market economists and market economists think about. So this is how economic view of environment look like. We measure societal well-being we have to ensure if we are willing to pay or willing to accept. When I say willing to accept, I am mostly talking about people who are living inside forest areas, these indigenous tribes and people for millennia and millennia, because they have been conserving these resources. So instead of willingness to pay, opportunity for willingness to accept can be given. And then classes of environmental values, it cannot be one value, it cannot be only economic value, it can be intangible value as well, that ensures circular flow of economy and environment. How circular flow of economy can be ensured? Market allocation to natural resources, ensuring that there is a market failure because positive and negative externalities take place, and how we can ensure what can be the appropriate government response, what can be appropriate government policy to address market failure. So these are a conceptual approach to the environment, how economical view looks like. And then modeling, as I talked in the very starting, modeling is more about understanding different scenarios, and based on scenarios, how better economic policies can be made. So this is how modeling can be done. I'll be talking also in my forthcoming slide, and giving a specific understanding on material energy balance. So this is a tool for quantitative understanding of the behavior of environmental system, material balance, and when we model what kind of pollutants are there, how they impact, what kind of energy is there, what kind of transport and freight is there, how much goes in the soil, how much goes as waste. This all should be considered. And for accounting of the flow of energy and materials out of the environment system, this very much so. If you do some of the previous research paper of some of the good researchers, and even we did some energy dynamics of Fodder Bank. So this is a very important and relevant, converting everything into energy and seeing how much of energy actually goes in that kind of activity and how justified it is. So this is the framework of environment economy model. This is also given in your book. I'll not go much into detail because there are forthcoming lectures where we'll be talking about this, how your demand leads to input and output of the system, and how capital, the labor capital, actually builds up this entire process. Then you have renewable and non-renewable sources, and entire process, how biodegradable and now non-biodegradable. Okay, so the interlinkages of all of them can be understood in this figure that I'll be talking in my next coming lecture. And this economy environment linkage helps us to permit different choices of final demand, technological process, and regional location. So there might be 2 or 3 different scenarios that emerge from them. And when we understand scenario and what leads to this scenario, we can rectify these initial attempts to improve the outcome of the scenarios that we can see in future. And accordingly, policies can be made, accordingly rectified approaches will be made to make sure that we are in the right way in the future, plausible alternative scenarios. So one of the example is the approach of market economists and free market economists in reducing externalities. I'm sure I described this, but I want to that when you assemble to the next class, please have a look to externalities. I already talked about market economists and free market economists in my previous slide. Have a look to that, and please come prepared for the next lecture on utility energy balance principle. If you have any questions, as we are already 20 minutes ahead of this, I can take a few questions. But if you don't have questions right now, please do write to these questions to your course coordinator.